This episode is part 2 of this story. If you haven't listened to part 1, you should go do that right now. Also, we have a limited number of signed first edition copies of Paul Piana's book, Big Walls. It tells the story of not only the Salathé, but the Great Canadian Knife, Mount Hooker, Half Dome, and more. The link is in your show notes. Finally, today's episode is sponsored by Tension Climbing. I make my living as a climbing coach, and the board I recommend more than any other is the Tension Board 2. As an early adopter of systemized spray walls, it's what I always imagined boards had the potential to be. You can learn more about the TB2 at their in-depth article on what it is, how it came to be, and how to use it the way they intended, with progression toward mastery in mind. That link is also in your show notes. The popular telling of the story is that in 1986, when Todd Skinner free climbed the Stigma, renamed it the Renegade, and claimed it as the hardest route in the Garden of the Valley Demi-Gods, he was quickly run out of Yosemite. But that's not what happened. Sure, it was probably a little unexpected that the same mavericks who had challenged the norms of climbing and pushed it further were now so stuck in their own ethical quicksand that they could no longer see the path forward. And yes, they definitely hassled him. John Backer gave him a fatherly lecture about ethics and right and wrong, but like any rebellious kid would do, Todd just used Backer's dusty disappointment as fuel. Respect your elders, but recognize that they might be wrong. So Todd Skinner didn't leave the valley. Instead, he went in search of the next step in the progression of the endangered game that Yosemite was famous for. He went up their most revered formation, El Capitan, in search of free climbing potential. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s.
1, 2.
In 1981, just after returning from a trip to Yosemite, Paul Piana opened his mailbox to find a copy of Mountain Magazine number 79. Sitting in Todd Skinner's dorm room at the University of Wyoming, he cracked it open to an article written by Mark Hudon called Long, Hard, and Free. Hudon and his partner, Max Jones, were the best free climbers in the valley, and they were pushing the free climbing onto the big walls. Paul read aloud from the article. On my first visit to Yosemite, I was obsessed with climbing the Salathé, and as I later became convinced it would go free, I became obsessed with it again. I heard myself tell Max that I was climbing, and suddenly the rock did not exist a few inches below my feet, a few feet above my hands. Every hold stood out in great detail, its angle and slope noted, foot placed just right. I was a climbing machine lost on El Cap. Nothing mattered. I was where I wanted to be and going where no one had been before. Both Paul and Todd knew that obsession, and they both wanted to feel that feeling. They wanted to link together the sequences of moves that no one else had. And in 1985, after finishing the Renegade, Todd remembered this. Despite not enjoying and not being very good at aid climbing, he rallied a partner and went up the Salathé to scout it for free climbing. Then in 1987, after climbing Grand Illusion and then the Phantom, he went up the Salathé again with Craig Smith to look at the route through a more experienced and more technically advanced lens. They climbed quickly through the lower half of the route, Todd quoting lines from Long, Hard, and Free whenever he encountered a familiar section. He knew where Hudon and Jones had been slowed down, so at those moments, he paid close attention. When they topped out on day 2, he was positive it would all go free. Satisfied, they jumped into Todd's bus and headed to Smith Rock. And Smith was hopping. A year and a half earlier, Mountain Magazine ran a Heinzach photo of Alan Watts on Chain Reaction to accompany an article by Jeff Smoot, and nearly immediately, people were booking plane tickets. Gilbert Tribou had done America's first 14A at Smith, and Todd wanted to know what that was like. Ron Kauk, John Backer, Mari Gingery, and a few other Valley locals arrived just after Todd and Craig. They, too, wanted to see what the fuss was all about. In a photo in Rockin' Ice number 20, Todd Skinner, in the foreground, is turned and looking over his shoulder, directly into the camera, with a huge grin. He's clearly delighted by something. In the background is John Backer, on to Bolt or Not to Be, hangdogging. In the same issue, when directly asked if he was seriously trying to climb the route, Backer responds, "No, if I really would have wanted to do the route, I would have yo-yoed it. I wouldn't have hangdogged it. I wanted to try hangdogging just for the sake of hangdogging. It didn't matter what route it was, but I saw that route, and the route didn't inspire me." Yeah, okay. Kauk, however, took to it. When Backer made a hasty exit, Kauk hung around, making quick ascents of several hard routes. Wearing lycra shorts and a cowboy hat, I might add. Times were changing, but we're getting sidetracked. By this time, Paul had left Laramie for the bright lights of Boulder, Colorado. Todd headed southeast to debrief. Sitting at Paul's house, they pored over topos and photos, making notes and planning for possible variations to bypass the spots that the two recon missions hadn't revealed as freeable. Todd had already committed to a few European competitions later that year, and then to a winter in Hueco Tanks. So they made plans for the following May. But they weren't the only ones dreaming of freeing the Salathé Wall. German ace Stefan Glowacz had already been training for months in anticipation of trying the route. In fact, there was a good reason that this route held the attention of so many. A storied history. But for that, we're going to have to go back.
What we're going to do right here is go back. Way back.
Whoa. Not really way back. I mean, this section is actually from last season's Freerider episode, which I guess was in the 1990s, so we're sort of going forward, but also looking backward. Anyway, for those of you who are new around here, or in case you need your memory refreshed, this is the 10-minute history of the Salathé Wall.
What we're going to do right here is go back. Way back. Back into time.
Even before Warren Harding started up El Capitan in July of 1957, climbers had stared at the broad expanse of golden granite to the left of the nose. Yvon Chouinard had gone as far as naming the entire wall in honor of his valley hero, John Salathé. Wayne Mary had already spotted crack systems out there, and Chuck Pratt was fairly sure that those crack systems could connect into a potential route. When Harding succeeded on the nose in a siege that took 45 days over 18 months for the first ascent of El Capitan, Royal Robbins knew he had to respond, but in better style. He had repeated the nose, but that ascent was made much easier due to the massive number of bolts Harding and team had already pounded in. I've seen numbers ranging from 125 to 200, so just a lot. Robbins knew he would have to complete a route of his own to show what could be done. In September of 1961, Robbins and Tom Frost sat in the meadow with binoculars scanning that great golden wall, and as Robbins writes, came to the giddy conclusion that a magnificent route lay there. Days later, Robbins and Frost started up with the best crack climber in the valley, Chuck Pratt. Over a few days, they fixed ropes to Hart Ledge at about 800 feet, using 13 bolts to get through the blank, slabby walls down low. They then wrapped to the ground and rested for 3 days while they gathered equipment before prusicking back to the base of the Hart. Steve Roper, in his seminal book Camp 4, writes, Then came the bravest act of all. Keeping just 3 ropes, the team hurled the others into the void. The umbilical cord had been severed. From September 18th to the 23rd of 1961, the trio pushed upward. No drama, no spectacle, and adding no more bolts, and topped El Cap via what would become known as the Salathé Wall. Royal Robbins would call it the finest rock climb on Earth. In an interview with Pat Ament for his book A History of Free Climbing in America, John Long says, "You'll never get the history right on the free blast since there were about 10 of us involved." In May of 1975, the initial 10 pitches of the Salathé Wall, or 11 depending on how you do it, where Robbins drilled the only bolts on the route, played host to a whole crew of stonemasters, including Backer, Calc, Bridwell, Long, and Mike Graham, all getting after it, trying to figure out how to free climb all the way to Mammoth Terrace. And through various efforts, the team had freed all but 2 pitches, a bolt ladder up high, and the third pitch, which had several pins and a small roof blocking the only handholds. Mike Graham, who, according to John Backer, was angry that Robbins had chopped some of Harding's bolts on the wall of early morning light, freed the bolt ladder and chopped Royal's bolts, eventually returning them to Robbins. Shortly after, Long and Backer went up to finish the third pitch. Long aided it, pulled the pins, and proceeded to free it at mid-511. The free blast was born, and it wouldn't take long before that effort enticed other free climbers further up the wall. 4 years, actually. In the fall of 1978, up-and-coming rock stars Mark Hudon and Max Jones were back east in New Hampshire. And while there, Jimmy Dunn mentioned to them that they should try to free the Salathé. They'd both already done the free blast and had aided the wall, so they had a good idea of what might stop them up there. And that thought stuck with them until the spring of '79 when they started up the route following their free-as-can-be tactic. Try to free things, but don't linger. If it's not going to go, just pull on gear and keep moving. With the exception of a short pendulum to hollow flake, which they didn't even consider trying to free as it would require bolts, they climbed all free to pitch 19, the double cracks above the ear, adding several new free pitches along the way. They did battle with this pitch 19, freeing all but 4 moves at the end. This pitch would later be a source of great speculation and controversy. But that's still coming. Stay with me. A couple of pitches later, and the team was on El Cap Spire. The 2 pitches above hadn't yet been freed, but they barely slowed Hudon and Jones down, checking in at 11C and 10D. After skipping past 2 short, tight corners that they figured would probably never go, they freed another new pitch, leading to Sous les Toits, and a couple of hard pitches just after it, bringing 512 to El Cap. This deposited the team below the fearsome, great roof of the Salathé. They gave the roof their best effort, freeing a fair bit of it, but were anxious to get to the headwall cracks. And those cracks didn't disappoint. Hudon believes that at the time, Max Jones was the best climber in the world. And so he took the lead up the first of the headwall cracks, freeing the majority of them, and while not clipping the anchor for a full free pitch, had done what ranked up there amongst the hardest pieces of climbing in the valley. Except this was at the top of El Capitan. In his 1981 article in Mountain Magazine, Long, Hard, and Free, Hudon writes, "By the time we reached the top, we'd free climbed all but 300 feet of the route. 100 feet of that only because it was wet. As we packed the bag for its quick trip down, I wondered if we'd done anything at all. Had we broken some mental barriers about free climbing on walls? I know that some of the pitches we free climbed and attempted to free are the most radical climbing ever done on a wall. But for some reason, I was depressed, bummed out. Maybe it's because that particular adventure was over. Maybe because he knew that it wouldn't be long before someone else freed the whole thing, the greatest rock climb on the planet. Or maybe simply because Mark knew that until somebody clips the chains and etches their name into the history books, the way we view the contributions of other climbers is to let their names fade into oblivion. And some certainly have. I've dug up what I can. In 1984, crack aces Alan Lester and Pat Adams made a quiet attempt, spending only a day and a half on the route, but freeing more of the aid remaining on the wall. A few years later, in 1987, German superstar Stefan Glowacz visited Yosemite with the goal of freeing the remainder of the Salathé. He trained obsessively for months to turn this dream into a reality. Full of nervous energy, but not quite sure what he was getting himself into, Glowacz started up the wall with a 4-man team. On day 1, they quickly climbed the free blast and explored the first unclimbed pitch, usually passed via a pendulum swing into hollow flake. Glowacz was sure he could make a down climb and traverse work, so he put bolts in and the team wrapped to the ground for one more night on terra firma. The next morning, after ascending the fixed lines, he fired the famous pitch first try at mid-512. With that success under his belt and the route now entirely free to the base of the 19th pitch, he was motivated to tackle that double crack corner, figuring he'd be through it by the end of the day. He was mistaken. Thin, flaring cracks had their way with him, and he never even got as close as Hudon and Jones had years earlier. Once he aided through, though, he reportedly freed it on top rope, but in the morning, when faced with the decision to continue on or give it a lead attempt, the team chose to continue on and maybe return to do the pitch later. But only a few pitches further up, they knew there would be no later. Stopped cold by the holdless groove now known as the Teflon Corner, all morale had disappeared. In his book, Rocks Around the World, Glowacz writes, "It's easy to be wise after the event. I'm sure we were the first people to make a serious attempt to climb the Salathé free, but now I realize it was not serious enough. Arriving at the top, I had no stomach for the grand panorama. I just wanted to get down to a good meal and a sleep. Lots of sleep. Then I just wanted to slip away unnoticed from the scene of my humiliation." El Cap had been drastically underestimated. But at this same time, there were 2 cowboys from Wyoming planning an attempt of their own. And rather than underestimate the big stone, they would bring to the valley a mountain of stubbornness and perseverance. Whoa, hold on. We're getting carried away here. Now that we're all caught up with the history, we'll be right back to tell the rest of this story. Hey everyone, we are nearly to the end of Season 2 of Written in Stone, and I have a few exciting updates. Number 1, pre-orders for our first book covering the 1990s will be up soon, and the first 50 or so people to pre-order will get to choose a signed photo of Gilbert Tribou or of Lynn Hill on some of their seminal routes from the 1990s. But the Secret Stoners Club, our Patreon, will be the first people to know about pre-orders, so you'd better get in there and join. It's free. Also, we've started a YouTube channel where I'll be adding some context to vintage videos and discussing some of the interesting points of climbing history. And I'd love it if you'd subscribe. We're aiming for 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year so that we can make a little money over there and keep this thing rolling. And finally, we have a limited number of signed copies of Paul Piana's book, Big Walls, right now. All of those links are in your show notes. As always, thank you for listening. In early May of 1988, Piana and Skinner rolled into the valley. They knew that no matter how hard they'd trained over the winter, they weren't going to just walk up and do the thing. Borrowing a smart tactic from far into the future, they decided that they'd go up the wall for a few days at a time, working on only the most difficult sections. First, Stefan's Traverse, then the thin crack above the ear. Just above there, they'd set up camp in the alcove, a large ledge at the base of El Cap Spire. They'd dial the gear and the moves to their satisfaction, and then move on to the next unknown. Or they'd go down, rest a few days, and then go back up. While on the wall, their roles became clear. Paul was the choreographer. He was often first to figure out the difficult sections and the one to see variations when a section of aid seemed unfreeable. He could fluently switch between crack and face climbing, where many were locked into seeing only their specialty. Todd was the performer. With more hard climbing under his belt, he knew how to execute. Once he or Paul had sorted out the method, Todd could usually just do the thing, no questions asked. Together, they were a fantastic team. After several of these camping trips, as they called them, they reached the slippery, thin dihedral they'd started calling the Teflon Corner, 24 pitches up the wall. With one of the biggest challenges of all still above them, the head wall, they realized that their camping trips were going to be less effective. They needed a new tactic. So in an even more unprecedented move, they drove to Tamarack Flats campground and set off on a nearly 9-mile hike with their entire camp on their backs. On the summit of El Capitan, overlooking the entire valley, they set up camp. Paul writes, "I couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculous nature of rappelling down El Capitan. What had seemed like hideous exposure on pitch 24 suddenly seemed no worse than the void experienced on short free climbs. We went as far as Sous la Toile Ledge, leaving fixed ropes that were ultimately anchored to a big block just over the rim. We then climbed back out to a stance just at the lip of the great roof and began work on the crack in the head wall." Now this all seems normal today, but the conventions being broken by the two Wyoming cowboys were ones held tightly by the valley locals. It was bad enough that they were hangdogging, but rapping in? Warren Harding hadn't hiked the easy way to the top. Well, that's true. Harding didn't hike to the top and rap in. Instead, he took 45 days spread out over 18 months and several pushes separated by months on the ground, often with ropes in place the entire time. And here's the thing. It made sense to start that way. But climbing needed to evolve, and oftentimes progress requires out-of-the-box thinking. Is it possible that if Skinner and Piana hadn't gone to the top and rapped into work pitches, that someday someone would go ground up and free climb a new route on El Cap without ever having rapped in to spot the free climbing possibilities or to try pitches? Sure, of course it's possible. But consider that to date, even with all of the easily available experience of free climbing on El Cap, it hasn't happened. It's certainly possible that it's because the routes have all just been taken by lesser tactics, but it's not likely. What's more likely is that this unprecedented move of rapping in to work out the pitches was simply ahead of its time. But unprecedented doesn't mean irreverent. In this case, it was quite the opposite. Of the incredible headwall pitches, Paul writes, "We were continuously impressed by the boldness of Frost, Pratt, and Robbins, who had dared to risk it all and were there first in 1961. They spent day after day rapping in and working on those pitches. Each lap up the improbable splitters left them alternating between in awe of El Cap, afraid of the sustained difficulty of the climbing, and absolutely inspired by the perfection of the cracks. They were chased off of the summit by a snowstorm, then returned to continue their work. They ran out of food. Nearly a month into their mission, they were also running out of money. They had one option: have a yard sale. They gathered together every piece of gear they thought they wouldn't need on the wall and laid it out in Camp 4, ready to haggle over prices. At the end of the day, they'd made enough money for either another camping trip or a final push. Todd's girlfriend, Amy Whistler, had come to Yosemite for a couple of weeks to help with preparation, and she had blown up her knee working on a hotshot firefighting crew in Alaska and was getting a check from the Forest Service. And that check meant that they could also afford Pop-Tarts and Snickers. Now they knew. A final push. They were going up the wall, and with Pop-Tarts, the living was going to be good. With John Christie and Bill Hatcher taking up photo duties and Mad Dog Bob Boehringer set to radio up daily weather reports, the team was ready to go. They packed a month's worth of food, water, and Pop-Tarts into their haul bags, even though they hoped they'd be on top in 2 weeks. Paul writes, "We had done our homework, but the magnitude of the final fight was still a heavy burden. Yet without the burden, there would be no appeal. We looked upward and vowed to take no prisoners." The first 10 pitches, the free blast, was a good warm-up, and they soon found themselves on Heart Ledge, facing the first hard pitch, Stefan's Traverse. Having climbed over 100 513s between the two of them, many on delicate faces, the pitch went down easily, and they were at the base of the nearly unprotectable hollow flake. With Paul on belay and Todd nearing the top of the pitch, the rope ran tight. Rather than tell Todd, who was 160 feet out with no gear, Paul unclipped from the belay and started climbing. With no gear between them, a fall would mean disaster, but the trust they'd built far outweighed the risk. Skinner finished the pitch, none the wiser until Piana reached the belay. The next pitch, the ear, is only 5'7", but Piana's hand-drawn topo in his book, Big Walls, calls it the scariest 5'7" in the world. A downward flaring chimney that somehow simultaneously threatens to trap your head and spit you out the bottom is definitely not for the faint of heart. But perhaps even scarier is what lies above, the first crux of the route. Many assumed that the top section of this pitch would never go free. In fact, they'd heard the rumors and had top-roped a possible variation, a gaping off-width to the left, now known as the Monster, which at the time was simply a pitch on a neighboring route, Bermuda Dunes. But as Paul put it, "Since we were aesthetically repulsed by this vile crevice, we decided we would have our way with the original aid pitch or else abandon the climb." And they knew that Max Jones had gotten close, within 4 moves, on his attempt at this section, and Todd had the benefit of having graduated from the school of Vedauwoo. Most people think of offwits when they hear that name, and that's certainly a warranted thought. But amongst some of the hardest offwits in the world are also hundreds, if not thousands, of RP seams and deviously flaring finger cracks. Between Vedauwoo and his time on the pin scars of the Renegade and City Park, Skinner was uniquely qualified for the demands of this pitch. Still, it was certainly one of the hardest single pitches he'd tried, and it didn't go easy. Now known simply as Pitch 19, it begins with a 50-foot section of 5'10" fist cracks to a small, no-hand stance where early aid teams belayed to break up the massive 150-foot rope stretcher. Skinner and Piana also belayed here in order to work out the tip's crack above. It took the rest of the day. But starting from the no-hand stance each time, Skinner threw himself at the pitch repeatedly. Through a combination of what Piana calls searing fingertip pin scars, laser-precise edging, and postdoctoral skills in body English, Skinner sent, giving it 13B. Another short pitch, and they settled into the alcove below El Cap Spire, a familiar home where Paul prepared camp while Todd patched up his battered fingers. Above El Cap Spire, the route wanders through squeeze chimneys, jam cracks, and face climbing until it deposits the climbers below a pitch that on the first ascent, Royal Robbins had solved with a pendulum. On the second ascent, Steve Roper repeated the pendulum, but subsequent ascents had found a more direct way. For the sake of free climbing, Skinner and Piana had spent considerable time here trying to find the way through. Sitting in a giant scoop of sorts, they had noticed several possible ways, and they tried to climb them. All resulted in failure. The original aid line and the new, more direct way, failure. 3 possible face climbs to the right, failure. At the left end of the ledge, where they'd returned over and over while trying to solve this conundrum, just out of sight around a corner, was the slippery dihedral they'd been hoping to avoid, the Teflon corner. They'd tried it on recon as well. Failure. But having exhausted all other options and believing the corner to be the closest they'd come, they set up beneath the water-worn groove. Todd did it first try, which meant that it was Paul's lead. A mossy and wet pitch that Paul describes as ugly as the head wall is beautiful, as if someone had diverted a sewer through the Louvre. This put them on the block. Paul writes, The bivvy on this sloped perch was the last grand floor to walk around upon. We could drop gear and get it back. Here, we spread out the picnic and glopped stolen Degnan's condiments on bean-smeared manna from hell, the petrified, jerky-like tortillas Todd learned to make from an ancient Mexican woman. We ate until we were full, or until our jaws were cramped from chewing. We paced in little circles. We dropped things just to see them stop falling. We slept. The next morning, they would climb through incredible pitches first freed by the inspired team of Hudon and Jones years earlier, including the 12B pitch just below the Great Roof, or, as Paul calls it, the Great Barrier Roof. I, for one, think we should just adopt this so as not to confuse it with the Great Roof on the nose. But I digress. Here, they set up 2 borrowed portaledges, one hanging below the other, and settled in. Of this camp, Paul writes, "The first night of several was spent here, lives and gear tangled across the hanging corner like some giant cobweb. Our little world was quite secure, but we could never truly relax. The position was too spectacular. Dropped gear fell a long, long way before we lost sight of it." The next morning, Paul awoke slowly. As the sky brightened, he tried to distinguish between the excitement, nervousness, and downright fear that he was feeling. The Great Barrier Roof isn't at all like the more famous Great Roof of the Nose. While it does start with a traverse to the right, the climbing then takes a direct line through the nearly 20-foot roof, stair-stepping up and out via big dead points to sloping jugs and an over-the-head heel-toe move, finishing in a tenuous shoulder scum. Paul writes, "All the while, my heart was slugging away, doing Mike Tyson imitations, while I made the tenuous step up onto a hands-down rest. We decided to throw in a belay here since we had the stance." And this seems like a good time to discuss the somewhat abstract style rules of big wall free climbing. Now remember, this was the first free climb of a route on the main wall of El Cap, so in some ways, the rules were very much in their infancy and have since evolved in several directions. What constituted a successful free climb was also changing, as yo-yoing had become red pointing and fixed gear versus placing gear was still in contention. So there was a gray area, places where the rules, a word I use very lightly, were malleable and certain stylistic decisions had to be made. Let's look at their choices. Paul and Todd chose to embark on a team-free ascent. Every pitch had to be lead free, but neither of them had to individually free every pitch. One would lead, the other would jumar, then they would switch. Their free push would start on the ground and end on top. They wouldn't return to the ground once the push had begun, or they would need to start over. Their definition of free was that they wouldn't hang on gear from anchor to anchor, and they would use the existing belays. They would largely stick to the original aid line, with the exception of what seemed impossible to free climb. There, they would explore variations. All of this was widely accepted in Yosemite Valley. Most of the gray area, at least for the Yosemite locals, came when they were on their camping trips. First, hangdogging to work moves and gear placements, and then rapping in from the top. Unheard of and largely unwanted at the time. But every new free route since has employed the same tactics, ones brought over from sport climbing and, let's be honest, good sense. However, pink pointing, sending with gear already in place, still wasn't widely accepted in Yosemite. In fact, it wasn't even widely accepted yet in sport climbing, and some of the harder pitches on the route seem to have been done this way. This, of course, becomes even more of a gray area when we start talking about the fixed pins left behind by aid climbers or stuck gear from previous parties, something that changes with every ascent. There's no problem with clipping that stuff, so the rule itself has its own gray areas that are hard to parse out. And that leaves one big gray area during this final push, that belay they installed above the roof, breaking up a pitch. The fact that it was at a no-hand stance, with serious rope drag potential through the roof below, is important. Had they added a hanging belay simply to make a pitch into 2 easier pitches, that might have crossed the line. But at a ledge where they could sit for an hour before continuing otherwise, it made perfect sense. And in fact, At the time, some people still considered it a free ascent of a pitch if the leader were to fall, lower down to a no-hand stance, even if that stance is in the middle of the pitch, and then continue up all free. Talk about malleable rules. And so, sitting on that ledge where they had established a new belay, one without bolts I might add, looking up at the headwall pitches, Todd and Paul were comfortable with what they'd done. They weren't finished by any means. Some of the hardest pitches still lie above them, but they knew they'd stuck to their own rules and could be transparent about what they'd accomplished. All they had left was the fight of their lives. We'll be right back. Look, I make my living as a climbing coach, but I'll be the first to tell you that ever since climbers first decided they wanted to get better, there's been one best way to improve: climb intentionally. So if you can do your climbing on terrain that was built specifically for that, it's a cheat code. And when it comes to this, there's one training board out there that stands above the rest: the Tension Board 2. Here's why. It was designed by people who actually train on boards. With mastery in mind, every decision made with purpose, and over 15,000 climbs in the database and growing, it's not even a question. On all levels, the TB2 is the final boss of training boards. The mix of wood and plastic allows for skin-friendly tiny grips as well as bigger, slopier, open-handed compression climbing. And there are 4 different board sizes to choose from, so whether you run a gym or built yourself a training shed, they've got one for you. And at the link in your show notes, you can learn all about how they made it, why they made it, and the best way for you to use it. Tension climbing. Mastery over success. When Todd was at the European competitions in late '87 and early '88, he bumped into Stefan Glovac and asked him about his time on the Salathé. Glovac was adamant about only one thing. There's no way that the pitch above the roof, the first headwall crack, will ever go free. It just didn't seem possible, and that makes perfect sense. Glovac hadn't spent time in Vedauwoo, where cracks that flaring were around every corner. But by the time they talked, Todd had seen the crack and knew Glovac was wrong. It would be hard, sure, but he'd climbed similar seemingly impossible flares before. And now that he was standing there with a few hundred feet of splitter cracks between him and the summit of El Cap, it looked a little harder, but just a little. Todd started up with confidence, and there was really no other choice because confidence was his only protection. With a couple of pins for the belay and no gear for the first crux 15 feet, a fall would mean, at worst, disaster, and at best, the scariest fall he'd ever taken, launching off the side of El Cap, thousands of feet above the ground, passing the belay ledge and roof, and coming to a bouncing, dangling stop, hanging in space, 25 feet from the wall. With that horror in mind, he very carefully watched his cup jams to make sure they weren't sliding as he pulled on them. The margin was too thin to wait until you could feel it coming out. Eventually, he made it to a gear placement and began to cross the technical face into the nearby crack. This Vedauwoo flare pitch, as Paul labels it in his topo, went at 13A, the second 513 of the route. Todd had done it first try of the day. With momentum on his side, Todd decided to try for the next headwall pitch as well. Paul writes, "The headwall must be the grandest climb in the universe, a beautiful and inspiring crack system splitting the 100-degree sweep of the Golden Wall at the top of El Capitan. The essence of the Salathé is distilled in this one incredible fissure. To be here, whether free climbing or aiding, is one of the most overwhelmingly good experiences a rock climber can have." Twice, Skinner climbed through the incredible pump only to fall at the final moves of the pitch, taking a 30-foot ride down the wall. Twice, he climbed on top rope back to his highest piece so that he could unclip it and jump off with enough rope to lower back to the belay. Frustration building, he tied in for a Hail Mary attempt. 90 feet up, he was flying through the air again. It was just too much. They wrapped back over the roof in the dark and pulled themselves into their hanging camp. In silence, they ate dinner and watched the tiny lights from cars driving into the valley. It was a long night. The following morning, Todd announced that he was sure he could do the pitch, but he'd need a rest day to get it done. The photo team had left the previous day, having gotten the shots they needed, and left fixed ropes to the top. With another 513 pitch above the enduro pitch that Todd was resting for, Paul figured he may as well go up and work it out some more. He'd been faring better on it than Todd, and planned to be the one to lead it. I must have fallen a nautical mile that day, but we gained valuable knowledge about subtle foot placements, and Todd did get a little rest. Even so, I was afraid I wouldn't be able to do it at all. Once again, they wrapped over the roof. Once again, a long night. Feeling a bit hesitant in the early morning, Todd needed a warm-up and a wake-up. Not easy when the only things in front of you are 513s situated 2,500 feet above the ground. And after jugging to the base of the next pitch, he relayed his plan to Paul, and then began climbing. And this pitch is all about endurance. It's long and relentless, building in difficulty until you've clipped the anchor. Todd had taken to calling it the lactic eclipse. Rather than risk a flash pump that could ruin the day, he climbed 20 feet above his piece, glanced down, and launched himself off the wall. 6 or 7 times he repeated this until he was no longer reluctant. The falls had become fun. Then he was ready. The sun hadn't hit the wall, and the valley below was still as Skinner began climbing. One jam after another, each with its own subtleties. Climbing far above his gear, he was in the zone, each position melting into the next. No forcing, no fighting. Todd had called it the most beautiful crack I've ever seen, and now he danced with it slowly, his breathing the only sound. When he clipped the next belay, they whooped, cutting through the quiet and shooting adrenaline into the day. Paul jugged up to join Todd. Todd looked serious. Are you ready? I am, but my fingers could use some prodding. For an hour, they sat at the belay, cleaning Paul's hands with alcohol, supergluing his skin back together, and covering the wounds with tape. Paul torqued his fingers hard into the crack to numb the pain. He motored through the 512 thin jams and wedged himself into a pod where he could rest before tackling the real difficulties. But this pod was a problem. On one hand, it allowed him to get back valuable energy. On the other hand, it allowed him to consider the possibilities above. On this day, Paul considered failure. He was feeling the pressure. It came down to this pitch, to him. As he left the pod, the flaring jams felt particularly difficult. He clipped the next piece and decided to downclimb back into the pod for more rest. He fell while retreating. After a pep talk, Paul Piana took a breath and began climbing again. He met the initial thin crack with confidence. At the pod, he felt relaxed. He still knew that he could fall, but he vowed to try his hardest. No retreat. The sun had found the right side of El Cap, turning it a golden orange. As the entire face gradually warmed, Paul was still tucked into a cool shadow, as if nature itself wanted him to succeed. As the first rays of light touched down on the valley floor, Paul Piana was calmly pulling toward the final difficult move, a huge span to a good hold. This would be one of the hardest pitches he'd ever climbed, and it was at the top of El Capitan. Todd was yelling up, "Hit it! Hit it!" A deliberate lunge, and I pinched the knob so hard that Arnold Schwarzenegger would have been proud. I cranked to the belay, laughing and waving my arms like a lunatic. Paul looked out at the now stirring valley from his perch on Long Ledge as Todd jugged up to meet him. They'd done the hardest pitches. They were ahead of schedule. A few pitches still blocked their exit, but with the hardest of those at 11 plus or 12 minus and consisting of overhanging, bolted climbing, they were as good as done. Happy with their morning work, they wrap down to start packing camp and moving it up to the ledge. When you're living on the wall, the climbing is only half the battle, sometimes less. Nearing the end of the day, they had moved their gear up, but were feeling restless. They wanted to go climbing. They wanted to go to the top. Todd traversed to the left end of Long Ledge where they had bolted a free variation, following an overhanging line of knobs. The original aid line had gone to the right end of the ledge and followed an improbable thin crack, but these knobs looked like more fun, and they represented the sea change that was happening in climbing, a trend toward more gymnastic climbing with a focus on difficulty and movement rather than simply adventure and summits. This pitch, however, bridged the gap. Modern climbing in a fantastic position, guarding the summit of the most famous wall in the world, and the place that had been the center of the climbing universe. It was, all at once, a notice of change and a love letter to the past. Tongue out in concentration, Skinner climbed flawlessly through the high heel hooks and big dead points to slopey side pulls. Paul led the next 5:10 crack pitch, and Todd climbed easily past the final 5:11 moves to the top. They'd done it. A route that their hero, Royal Robbins, had first climbed. A route that free climbing pioneers Hudon and Jones had explored for its futuristic potential, pushing boundaries and changing the game along the way. A route that many of the best climbers had claimed would never go free. They'd collected the necessary skills on much smaller walls, the flares of Vedauwoo in Nowhere, Wyoming, the knob pinching of the Needles, the pin scars of the Renegade and City Park, the gymnastic, dynamic climbing of Hueco Tanks, Texas. They'd brought it all to Yosemite Valley in a beat-up VW bus and hauled it up El Capitan for the first free ascent of the finest rock climb on Earth. They raced the sunset back to Long Ledge and radioed down that the Salathé was theirs. And then they celebrated. Extra Pop-Tarts. It was June 15th, 1988. We'll be right back. Hey everybody, just a quick reminder, our first book, written in stone, the 1990s, is coming out soon. Pre-orders will be up this week, and if you are a secret stoner, it's free to join. You will get first dibs on the pre-orders. That's important because it'll be a discounted price, and the first 50 pre-orders will get to choose between a signed photo of Lynn Hill on the nose or a signed photo of Jibe Tribu on Just Do It. Not to mention, when you become a secret stoner, you get a bunch of bonus episodes and my unwavering gratitude. The link is right there in your show notes. On June 16th, 1988, Craig Herzog and friends were climbing Moby Dick, a 5:10 fingers to fist crack at the base of El Cap, not far from the start of the Salathé Wall. Less than a week earlier, competition climbing had debuted in America at Snowbird, Utah, and the talk around the valley was undoubtedly not about Patrick Edlanger's incredible finals performance, but about the fact that Ron Kalk, Stonemaster and Valley legend, had defected. Not only was he clipping bolts, but he was competing on artificial walls. What was next? Lycra? While the debate raged on about the value and validity of the direction that climbing seemed to be going, Herzog caught something out of the corner of his eye. Something falling. Rock! But it wasn't rock that he saw. Two black haul bags tied together with a length of turquoise rope came crashing through the trees and cratered about 30 meters from the wall. Rock and debris came raining down with them. Looking back up, he saw something else falling that landed on a ledge. It looked like a body. It was early in the afternoon on a Thursday, so knowing that not many people were around, but rangers would be in the office, Herzog hurried to a phone. Within the hour, rangers were on the scene. The haul bags had exploded when they hit the ground. Rangers surmised that this hadn't been the usual haul bags thrown off the top to avoid carrying them down scenario. The contents weren't something someone would have just thrown off. Not to mention the obviously cut ropes. Scanning the face of El Cap through binoculars, Park Ranger John Jackson spotted a purple jacket on a ledge. Luckily, not a body. Climbers on the nose were contacted and determined to be fine. But what about Todd Skinner and Paul Piana? Everyone knew they were up on the Salathé trying to free the impossible pitches. Where the hell were they? 2 hours and 15 minutes after the bags hit the ground, the search was called off. Still, no sign of Skinner and Piana. Now, what the Rangers didn't know, and didn't investigate, was that on the top of the wall, a little over 2 hours earlier, chaos had erupted. Let's rewind. The remainder of this story comes directly from Paul Piana's excellent book, Big Walls. The next morning was perfect. We breakfasted and started hauling freight to the rim. We joked about being extra careful, as most fatal auto accidents are said to occur within 2 miles of home. I was the first over the rim and selected the best anchor I could find. We had already used this huge block, as had years of Salathé climbers. Off to one side was a fixed piton to which I anchored Todd's line. I plugged in a number 1 friend to make sure. While Todd ascended the pitch, I used the block as a hauling anchor and as my tie-in as well. When the bags reached the lip, I was unable to pull them over myself and waited for Todd to arrive. While waiting, I decided that I might as well be embarrassingly paranoid and clipped the fixed pin as well. Todd reached the rim and I made him pose for pictures like Leighton Core at the top of the Salathé. Since he was on top and pulling up extra rope, I began taking out the anchors. I removed the friend, then turned and started lifting the haul bags. We heard a terrible grating noise, and turning back, were horrified to see that somehow the block had come loose. I'm not exactly clear about what happened next. Todd remembers me putting my hands out at the block and yelling, "No!" I do remember the two of us being battered together and the horror of seeing my best friend knocked wildly off the edge, and then a tremendous weight on my left leg as I was squeegeed off the rim. I recall a loud crack like a rifle shot, then more pummeling, and suddenly everything stopped spinning, and I could just peek back up over the edge. Everything was in tatters, ropes pinched off and fused. It appeared they'd all been cut. I was afraid to touch anything and sick with the knowledge that Todd had probably just hit the talus. Suddenly, a startling bass squeak sounded below me, followed by a desperate, "Grab the rope!" I hauled myself over the top, and soon a bloody hand on a crushed ascender slid over the rim. I helped Todd up, and we laid there for a long time. We were terrified because Todd was having trouble breathing, and his pelvic area hurt very badly. My leg was in a really weird position and reaching a crescendo of pain. I don't know how long we were there, afraid to move for fear of fainting and unraveling the braid of cut ropes that held us. When we did get up, we discovered that Todd's line appeared to be okay. He had been held by one of his CMI ascenders. Apparently, the rock had scraped over the ascender and, miraculously, that small, gouged, and bent piece of metal had kept Todd's rope from being cut. I had been held by the loop I'd clipped to the fixed pin. The 11mm rope with which I'd tied into the block had been cut as easily as a cotton shoelace. 2 other 9mm ropes were in 8 or 9 pieces, and the haul bags were talus food. We coiled the remaining rope and slowly started down the east ledges. A descent that usually took us just under 2 hours required almost 7, and we arrived at the base of Manure Pile Buttress looking much worse than the average wall climber who staggers down that trail. Besides being battered, cut, and more than a little rattled, Todd suffered several broken ribs, and a piece of bone was broken off of his hip bone. My left leg was severely gouged and broken in 5 places. We had dreamed, we had trained, and we had struggled. Even though the climb ended with a nightmare, we had triumphed. I'm sure that the ecstasy will live inside us forever. Sometimes at night, as I'm drifting off to sleep, I suddenly hear that big block move and I see Todd tumble off the rim. I think about how difficult it would have been for our families if we'd been killed. I shudder at the remembrance of being dragged off the summit of El Capitan and knowing that we were really going to die. For me, the definition of horror is now an emotion. Now that years have passed and Todd and I have healed, I'm even more pleased with our climb. Especially for 1988, the climbing is unrelenting in its severity and the logistics are staggering. We worked harder than anyone else was willing to work, harder than we thought we could. We were willing to see our most shining goal become a tormenting failure. Yet, we were prepared to fail and fail and fail until we finally could succeed. We are very happy and very proud of having made the first free ascent of the Salathé, not just because of perseverance and success, but because it proved that great work yields great reward. I'm pleased that by opening this milestone of a door, we had learned to walk bravely through, to continue in our quest to live out our wildest dreams. Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. In the next couple of weeks, our patrons will be getting a recording I made of Paul Piana telling this story at the International Climbers Festival a few years ago. You can join for free at the link in your show notes. And remember, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And if you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review, join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know, at the crag, at the gym, and those climbers who believe that just because they can't do it means it must be impossible. Tell them all, and together we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners. This was our final story of the season. That's a little bittersweet. I really like putting these stories together. I'm also tired. I'm really tired. It's 9 p.m. on Sunday night. I have a mix of this episode that I need to listen to make sure of some details before I sign off on it to go out. So it's going to be 11:30 before this thing goes out, most likely, or this thing gets uploaded to the interwebs. But before I do anything else, I just want to first shout out to Shane Jordan, our newest legend. I appreciate you so much. To all of our new free Secret Stoners Club members, thank you for joining. Having so many new people latch onto this thing this season means there's definitely a season 3. There's no question about that. Despite how tired I am right this moment, there's definitely a season 3. We'll talk later about what season 3 is going to be. I already know. But this one was a struggle. And it's one of the stories I knew the best. And the struggle came from a couple of different directions. Number one, I didn't want this to be about Alex Huber, and it very easily could have turned into that. I had mostly moved past my... That's not true. I hadn't moved past my extreme disdain for Alex Huber. That will always exist. I just think he's a bad human from everything that I've learned. But when Jordan Cannon recently free climbed the Salathé, doing it Paul and Todd's way, following their pitches, the original free Salathé, and improving on their style, I was having conversations with Jordan and with Jim Herson, who was the first person to repeat pitch 19 and to do the original Salathé, free Salathé, the way that Paul and Todd had done it. I was having conversations with them about what are the facts, what do we know, more little details that are way in the weeds, getting super nerdy in the weeds. But that brought it back to the forefront. And at the same time, we're working on the 90s book and the Fred Ruling episode and the Free Rider episode. I'm in the midst of those again. So Alex Huber's fresh on my mind. And I went down a rabbit hole about Barnaby Fernandez and Orujo, which he claimed as an early 9A and the first 9A plus in the world. And I'm going to make a story about it because it's fascinating. But Huber is also there, claiming that Barnaby Fernandez should not be able to give these grades. So I didn't want this to become about Huber, and I had to stop myself multiple times from bringing it up because I wanted it to be a celebration of what Todd and Paul actually did, not the detractors later on. And that also is part of the pressure for me because I'm so close to it all. My wife was the nanny for Todd's kids. Amy Skinner is a great friend of mine. The Skinner family are good friends. Paul is a good friend. In the inscription on the book that I've been reading for a lot of this, I have it right here next to me. Let me read it. In the inscription on Paul's Big Walls book, he wrote, "To my friend Chris, I admire all of your talents, stories, writings, and climbing. Best of all, I'm happy you're such a good friend. But don't snitch my projects. Your friend, Paul Piana." I did text him and ask him if I could finish No Time Not To last season. But that's why there was so much pressure. Because I admire what those guys did. And I'm trying to add to that legacy. That's where the pressure comes from. I know I'm good at this. I know I am. I don't have to, that's ego talking, but it's also just, I put a lot of time into this. But they were also really good at what they did. And I want to make sure that what I make matches what they did. So a lot of pressure. I was actually thinking about this earlier today because I needed to get away from my computer and get this episode out of my head a little bit. So I went and finished cleaning a route that I recently bolted. And it's out at the same cliff as No Time Not To. There are a bunch of Paul routes out there. In fact, the best routes at that cliff are Paul Piana's. Two amazing 12As side by side and a really long 11D that is just incredible. One of the top 3 11Ds I've ever climbed in my life, for sure, no question. And I bolted this thing out there that's this, 75 or 80 foot route that goes out a 20 foot roof, horizontal roof. And I could have climbed it a few days ago, but I knew it wouldn't be up to Paul Piana standards. He spent a lot of time cleaning those routes, making sure that whoever was going to climb them next, whoever was going to climb them in 20 years, was going to have a great experience. So when I'm out there bolting, I'm trying to live up to the standard that he set at that cliff here in Lander in general, which I guess didn't really get this episode out of my head very well. But I think I've done a good job out there as well. And frankly, while I was finishing cleaning it up, I was like, you know what? This might be as good. It might be better than the routes that he did out here. As long as it can stand on the same podium, that's what I'm looking for. Okay, couple of quick updates here. I don't want to ramble for too long. My wife and my toddler are on their way home from out adventure hiking, and I need to get dinner ready. But I do want to update you. Book pre-orders will be up this coming week. They'll be coming in different levels. Legends and rock stars get first dibs. Then it will go to all of the rest of the people in the Patreon, the secret stoners. They will get next. Then eventually it will go out to the public. So be on the lookout for that. I will be sending it to your emails as well as to putting a post in the Patreon. Also, I have been locked in a battle with the post office for the last 3 or 4 weeks because I got Lynn Hill to sign a bunch of photos of her on the nose so that I could give them away. And those got lost in the mail and they ended up in Cincinnati. I don't live in Cincinnati. In fact, they ended up at a post office in Cincinnati I'd never lived anywhere near. We did an intercept. We intercepted the package, then they lost it. And we went back and forth and back and forth. They told us it had been delivered to us in Lander. Not true. We went to the Lander post office. They said, nope, was never here. We've never scanned it here. They're lying to you. Finally, after I called, I bet 40 times, to the post office branch. Don't call the post office customer service number. You'll never get a human. I got the phone number of the branch and I called the branch. They found them. Finally. I had my daughter go pick them up. She took photos and sent them to me to prove that they exist because I was doubting it. And she has sent them to me. So that was the last big box I needed to check for this book pre-order, and it has been checked. So we will be getting that out to you this coming week. Thanks, everybody, for your support. I'm going to go make dinner right now. Next week, I have 2 conversations recorded about this episode, and I am recording a third. I was going to be done with the season, but I'm recording another one because I think it's important, and it's going to be so fun. Anyway, the next one you're going to get is one of Todd and Paul's best friends, someone who was dramatically influenced by them both, and that even though this wasn't the point of the interview, there's a moment in it where I realize that Todd did something for them that goes beyond friendship. All right. I'll see you guys next week.